In this PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the back end of web applications. So let's begin with talking about the front end. Basically, the front end is the parts of the web page that the visitor can interact with and see. So various tools and frameworks can be used to make a web page, but at the very core, the front end is composed of JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and other static assets like images or videos. So if you have taken Info 2105 and 2106, we worked exclusively in the front end. Okay, so we learned HTML and CSS and JavaScript to create the front end part of your web app or your website. So we use things like images and videos maybe, and HTML pages, CSS pages. So these are static assets. Static assets are files that don't change. Basically, when a visitor navigates to a web page, these assets are then sent to their browser from the web server. So in the front end, we talk a lot about the client side. Okay, so front-end development is also referred to client-side development. So in the case of visiting a website, the client, who we refer to as a client or what we refer to as a client, is actually the browser. The client's not a customer or an actual client. Okay, so in other circumstances, when we refer to a client, it might also be another application, a mobile device, or a smart appliance. Okay, so the client is the browser, the application, the mobile device, your phone. So while the front end is the part of the website that makes it to the browser, that is what people see when they look at their browser or their phone, the back end is what consists of all the behind the scenes processes and data that make a website function and then send resources to the clients. So let's talk a bit about the web server first before we jump into the back end. So the front end consists of the information sent to a client so that a user can see and interact with the website. So this information that they see that allows them to interact with the website, this information comes from the web server. So a web server is a process running on a computer that listens for incoming requests for information over the internet and sends back responses. So each time a user navigates to a website on their browser, the browser then makes a request to the server of that website. So every website has at least one server. If it's a very big website, then it would have more than one server. So the specific format of a request that is made and the resulting response is called the protocol. Now, HTTP is the protocol used to access websites. When a visitor navigates to a website on their browser, they make an HTTP request for the resources that make up that site. So the web server then receives that request and sends the client a response containing everything needed to view the website. So this is called a static website. That doesn't mean that the website isn't interactive. As with the individual static assets, a website is static because once these files are received, they don't change or move. A static website might be a good choice, for a simple portfolio site or personal website with short bio and photos, things like that. So what we're going to be looking at in this course is more of a dynamic website with dynamic content. In more complex websites, modern web applications often cater to the specific user rather than just sending the same files to every visitor of the web page. This is known as dynamic content. Okay, the content is different depending on different variables. The web application's backend will then need to hold the logic for deciding which assets to send then. So here's an analogy for the backend. When we dine at a restaurant, we get the dining experience, right? But remember that there's a lot happening behind the scenes to make the restaurant work. Things like how ingredients have to be ordered from suppliers, how new menus have to be designed, how employee schedules are created, and so on. So the same thing with a web application. In order to make a web application that runs smoothly, the backend is doing a lot more than just simply sending assets to the browser. So a restaurant is more than just a waitress bringing food to your table. There's a lot of different things happening in the background. Right, so I've mentioned the word application a few times. So when we talk about application or application server, what we're really referring to is the collection of programming logic required to deliver dynamic content to a client, to manage security, to process payments, and also other tasks. Now, these are just 3 of many tasks that the application server does. It's responsible for sending an email confirmation after a purchase. So these are examples. Another example is running the complicated algorithms that a search engine uses. Now, remember that data is a big deal. We need to think about storing the data. Modern web applications collect a lot of data. So every time, there's a credit card number entered on an e-commerce site, or every time you hit pause on Netflix, there's a timestamp. All this information, all this data is being collected. So for that data to be useful, it needs to be organized and stored somewhere. So they're stored in databases. The backends of modern web applications always include some kind of a database, and often more than just one. So databases are collections of information. There's 2 types, relational databases and non-relational databases, also known as NoSQL databases. So let's look at relational databases first. So relational databases store information in tables with rows and columns. So SQL, or Structured Query Language, is a programming language for accessing and changing the data stored in these relational databases. So examples are MySQL and PostgreSQL. The second type I mentioned is the NoSQL databases. So these are non-relational databases that use other systems such as key value pairs or a document storage model. So examples are NoSQL databases include MongoDB and Redis. So in addition to the database itself, the backend needs a way to programmatically access, change, and analyze the data stored there. So in order to have consistent ways of interacting with the data, you need more than just a database. You also need what we call a web API. The backend will often include a web API. When a user navigates to a specific item for sale on, let's say, an e-commerce site, the price listed for that item is stored in the database, right? So when they purchase it, the database will then need to be updated with the correct inventory for that item type. So there'll be one less if the customer bought one, okay? So much of what the backend entails is reading, updating, deleting information stored in the database. So it's not like you just store it in the database and you're done. There's all this stuff happening with that data, like reading it or updating it, changing it or deleting it, right? So this is where API comes in. API stands for Application Program Interface. So Web API is a collection of rules for interacting with a web application's data. So this is often through a HTTP request response cycle. So unlike the HTTP request the client makes when he navigates to a website's URL, as we talked about earlier, this type of HTTP request indicates how it would like to interact with a web application's data. So how to create new data, read existing data, update existing data, or delete existing data. And it receives some data back as a response. So example of making an online purchase. So let's take a look at that. When a user presses a button to submit an order, a request to send them to a different view of the website, an order confirmation page, okay? An additional request is also triggered from the front end, which is unseen by the user to the web API. So the first thing that happens, they see a different page that says, okay, you've bought your shirt. That's in the front end. But there's also something else happening in the back end so that the database can be updated with the information from the order. Okay, so there's something else happening back there as well. Now, there are open and closed APIs. Some web APIs are open to the public. Instagram, for example, has an API that other developers can use to access some of the data Instagram stores. Others can only be used by the web application internally. Next, we're going to look at authorization and authentication. These are two concepts that we'll want our server-side logic to handle. Two very important things. So the first one is authentication, the process of validating the identity of the user. So one technique for authentication is to use logins with usernames and passwords. Of course, we all do that, right? Even to get onto your web campus or check your Outlook. So these credentials need to be securely stored in the back end on a database and checked upon each visit. So web applications can also use external resources for authentication. You've likely logged into a website or application using your Facebook or Google, right? So that's an authentication process. Next, we have authorization. Authorization is what controls which users have what access to which resources and actions. So certain application views, like the page to edit a social media personal profile, are only accessible to that user. Okay. Other activities like deleting a post are simply similarly restricted. So when building a robust web application backend, we need to incorporate both the authentication, so who is the user, who do they claim to be, and authorization. Once they log in, what are they allowed to do, what are they allowed to see? Okay, so we have to build this into our server-side logic to make sure that we're creating a secure, personalized, and dynamic content. Okay, so next I want to talk about different back-end stacks. So unlike the front end, which must be built using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, there's a lot of flexibility in which technologies can be used in order to create the back end of the web applications. Developers can construct backends in many different languages like PHP, Java, JavaScript, Python, and more. So next we'll talk about frameworks. Okay, you don't need to reinvent the wheel to create robust backend. Instead, most developers make use of frameworks. So what are frameworks? Frameworks are collections of tools that shape the organization of your backend. So you don't need to make everything from scratch. Use frameworks. Frameworks provide efficient ways of accomplishing what could be otherwise very difficult tasks. So there are numerous backend frameworks from which developers can choose, and here are some examples. So framework Express.js uses JavaScript, Ruby on Rails uses Ruby, Spring uses Java, Flask and Django uses Python, and ASP.NET uses C#, which is what we're doing in this course. Okay, next we'll talk about full stack. The collection of technologies used to create the front end and the back end of a web application is referred to as a stack. So full stack simply means working both the front end and the back end, so everything. The LAMP stack, sometimes considered the standard stack, uses Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. The mean stack uses MongoDB, Express.js, AngularJS, and Node.js. Anyway, so let's review. Okay, to summarize this PowerPoint, the takeaways are the front end of a website or application consists of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then static assets that are sent to a client like a web browser. A web server is a process running on a computer somewhere that listens for incoming requests for information over the internet and sends them back responses. So an example is listens for the request for, HTML file and CSS and images, and it sends that to the browser, to the client, right? So storing, accessing, and manipulating data is a large part of web applications backend. So the data is stored in databases, which can be relational databases or NoSQL databases. There's two kinds. The server side of a web applications is also sometimes called the application server, handles important tasks such as authorization and authentication. The back-end application, okay, often has a web API, and this is a way of interacting within an application's data through this is a way of interacting with an application's data through HTTP requests and responses. So together, the technologies used to build the front end and back end of the application are called the stack, and many different languages and frameworks can be used to build a robust back end. And here is a diagram here that might be useful for you. So here we have the client, such as the web browser, and here we have the web server that stores, all the, web files like HTML, CSS, image files, videos, and so on. But on the back end, there's more than just that. We have the application server. Okay, we have the web API here that helps you create, read, update, delete data from the database. Okay, and they all work all together in conjunction with each other and then sends information to the client. And that is it for this PowerPoint. You can move on to the next one after you're done with this.